Today, we celebrate the 4th of July, American Independence Day, with barbecues, pools, beach vacations, and drinking. And why not celebrate? It is the birthday of our country, after all. But have we lost a real understanding of how important this event truly was in 1776, and how important it is now? How do we get 13 individual, stubborn colonies to come together for such a momentous experiment that would result in 50 states and several protectorates? I'm Scott Wilkins, and this is The Past and the Present, 4th of July. So in 1763, France and England would conclude the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. England had gained the whole of Canada in the war, but had seemingly gone broke in doing so, as well as protecting its original 13 American colonies. These colonies were as diverse as the people who would eventually represent them. Hard-working coastal traders of New England, religious zealots and European immigrants in the middle colonies of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and the aristocratic slaveholders in the southern states. They would all be taxed as a way to pay for their protection. The first of many acts of Parliament would be the Proclamation of 1763, which essentially forbade colonists from migrating west, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, regardless of what the original colonial charters stated. In 1764, the Sugar Act would be passed, which taxed imported sugar, coffee, wine, textiles, and indigo, and also forbid the import of foreign rum and French wine. I should probably stop here and say that anytime something was forbidden, it was actually taken as a challenge by the colonists, and they would pursue whatever it was aggressively. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which taxed any and every kind of printed material. In October of that year, we see the colonies come together for the first time. Well, mostly. 9 of the 13 colonies would be represented in the Stamp Act Congress, which requested the repeal of the Stamp Act and the Acts of 1764. The major thing to come from this gathering was the term no taxation without representation, meaning the colonies wanted to have some say on what they are taxed on and how much they should pay. In March of 1766, King George III would officially repeal the Stamp Act, and little did anyone know, it would give acknowledgement to a united colonial front. The build-up to independence was slow, but the colonists had gotten a taste of working together. What's more, the king had listened to them. The ball was rolling, and there was now no way to stop it. Still hurting for money, in 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts to generate revenue on taxed paper, tea, glass, lead, and paints. A colonial board of customs was also established in Boston. For 3 years, the colonies will boycott imported goods as well as spread circulars through local assemblies denouncing taxation without representation, published by men of the growing Sons of Liberty. The most famous of these sons would be in Boston, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the other 12 colonies each had their own group of Sons of Liberty. Then, on March 5th, 1770, a protesting mob gathers around the town hall in Boston, and a verbal altercation broke out between the citizens and the soldiers standing guard. Events escalated, and the troops fired into the crowd, killing 3, mortally wounding 2 others, and injuring 6. In Paul Revere's famous engraving, the citizens are weaponless before a British firing squad, and it is dubbed the Boston Massacre. The captain of the soldiers, Thomas Preston, and 8 others are arrested and charged with murder. Then, something beautiful happens, and John Adams, cousin of Samuel Adams, eventual signer of the Declaration of Independence and future president, offers his services to defend the British soldiers. Adams wanted the men to have a fair trial, and in October of that year, Captain Preston and 6 others are found innocent. 2 soldiers are found guilty, branded, and then released. Over the next 3 years, the colonies will establish individual committees of correspondence to communicate with each other and to set the wheels in motion for self-rule. While all this was happening with the growing mobs and the rise of the Sons of Liberty, it is important to note that independence was still not an option. The colonists wanted self-rule, yes, but they wanted it within the form of an American parliament within the larger British parliament, kind of the way Ireland is today in the United Kingdom. Had the king and parliament acquiesced, 4th of July would just be another date on the calendar. On May 10, 1773, in an attempt to bail out the struggling British East India Company, the Tea Act is passed and takes effect. The irony of it all was that the act was merely an extension of a previous Tea Act in effect for 6 years. The only added measure was that the East India Company would have a monopoly on all tea imported into the colonies by underselling American merchants. Protests would occur all throughout the colonies, but the biggest one would of course take place in Boston. In October, 3 ships filled with tea would anchor in Boston Harbor, but would be told not to unload their cargo. On December 16th, after failing to get the ships to leave the Boston harbor, Bostonians will disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians, board the 3 ships, and dump all 342 crates of tea into the water in what would be called the Boston Tea Party. Predictably, the king was angry, and through 1774, various new laws would take effect against the citizens of Boston, the colony of Massachusetts, and eventually all 13 American colonies. They would be called collectively the Coercive Acts, or, in America, the Intolerable Acts. First, the Boston Port Act, which shut down Boston Harbor until the tax on the tea dumped into the water was paid and the East India Company was repaid. Second was the Massachusetts Government Act, which revoked the 1691 charter of the colony, and any new governor would be chosen by the king. It also gave the new governor sole authority in appointing any government official, as well as forbade any of the traditional town halls. That new governor would be General Thomas Gage, commander of all British troops in North America. Gage would be in charge of implementing these new acts, including the third one, the Administration of Justice Act, which protected any royal official of being sued in any colonial court and instead sent them back to England for trial. Fourth was the Quartering Act, which provided that the colonies must provide housing to members of the military. Fifth, the Quebec Act, which centralized the government in Canada, as well as pushed its southern boundaries south into territory claimed by Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia. Then, in a sign of things to come, in September, General Gage seized the colony's arsenal at Charleston. By isolating what the Crown saw as troublemakers in Boston, they hoped that the rest of the colonies would fall in line. Instead, 56 delegates from 12 colonies would meet in Philadelphia that month for the First Continental Congress. From September 5th to October 26th, these delegates would denounce the Coercive Acts and state that they are not to be obeyed. They will propose the creation of local militias and draft a declaration of resolves to be sent to England opposing the taxation laws and any other measure that infringes on their self-rule. Among these rights that they are asserting they have a claim to are life, liberty, and property. The Congress adopts a formal boycott of imported goods and agrees to come together yet again in 1775. Still under martial law, a provincial Congress is established in Cambridge on February 1st. Across the ocean, still not seeing Massachusetts comply with the Coercive Acts, the colony is recognized in a state of rebellion, and more troops are sent to the colony to put it down. Massachusetts isn't alone, however. The other colonies have been helping out by trading goods internally and recognizing the unfair and heavy-handed actions of the king. On March 23rd, in front of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry delivers a fiery speech, ending with the words, "Give me liberty or give me death." At the end of the month, a new law is supported by King George III, called the New England Restraining Act, which required the colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut to trade exclusively with England, and the dagger to the heart banned fishing in the North Atlantic. This was the lifeblood of the New England colonies. Now, believing that there was an open rebellion, General Gage is ordered to suppress it by any means necessary. The very act designed to divide the colonies actually drew them together, and the acts of putting down a rebellion would go on to start one. On the night of April 18th, acting on the directive, Gage orders 700 soldiers to march on Concord and seize a weapons stockpile that is supposedly in the town. Paul Revere, William Doss, and a few other riders set out from Boston to warn the countryside of the march. A few disclaimers. Paul Revere did not ride alone. He became the heroic figure of the event, but he was not the sole actor. Also, he was not shouting, "The British are coming." Technically, they were all British subjects. His warning was more along the lines of, "The Redcoats are coming." Of course, another event that became legend was the hanging of lanterns in the steeple of the Old North Church in Boston, with one if by land and two if by sea, referring to the southern route over the neck of Boston, or two lanterns for the northern route via the Charles River. Two lanterns shone that night, briefly, as the British did indeed cross the Charles River and proceed to Concord. Thanks to Revere and Doss, the countryside was alarmed, and the Minutemen of Lexington were waiting. However, in the early morning hours, they began to disperse into the local tavern to get some rest as no sign of soldiers appeared. By dawn, it was a different story, as the Minutemen rushed back onto the common to see the glistening of bayonets marching toward them. Being told to disperse, they lingered briefly and slowly began to back down. And then, it was the shot heard round the world. Who fired it? Historians have debated that question ever since, but what ended up happening as the American War for Independence officially started on that green. The British would march on to Concord, but find no weapons and leave for Boston in the late afternoon. They would skirmish on Concord Bridge before returning to the city, all the while being harassed by the Minutemen, falling in from surrounding towns. Eventually, by nightfall, with the soldiers back in Boston, the city would be under siege as more groups of militia joined up. At this point, independence was still not the main objective. It was about their rights that, once addressed and dealt with, would give them a voice inside the British Parliament. As word spread, delegates started arriving to the Second Continental Congress, including John and Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who would be nominated as President of the Congress. The first act of the Second Continental Congress would be to send an olive branch petition to the king. They declared their loyalty to the crown and pled for a peaceful resolution. Next, after Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold successfully capture Fort Ticonderoga in New York on May 10th, the Congress votes unanimously for George Washington to be named Commander-in-Chief of all colonial forces, soon to be called the Continental Army. My favorite part of all this is that George Washington had shown up to the Congress in full military dress. He knew what was going to happen, and he accepted his appointment without pay. 2 days after he was appointed, June 17th, the Battle of Bunker Hill takes place in Boston. Actually fought on Breed's Hill, 2,000 British soldiers would rush up the hill to the entrenched Americans, who were told not to fire until they see the whites of their eyes, for fear of missing their target. Taking the hill cost the British about 1,000 men to 400 on the American side, including Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent figure in Boston who was certainly destined for greatness. The third thing Congress does is to begin printing money to pay for their new army. Finally, they create a committee to conduct negotiations with foreign governments in case the olive branch petition is rejected, which it is. Independence was now beginning to become on their minds, and to begin 1776, Thomas Paine published a 50-page pamphlet in Philadelphia arguing for independence and stating, "We have in our power to begin the world anew. America shall make a stand, not for herself alone, but for the world." In March, Washington fortifies Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston with the help of some cannon brought by Colonel Henry Knox from Fort Ticonderoga. Dorchester Heights was too high up to be hit by British cannon, and it forced them to evacuate the city to a destination unknown. Half the attacking army had been lost at Bunker Hill, and now they had been forced to evacuate Boston. The Americans were holding their own, and those in Congress began to come around more to the idea of independence. On April 12th, the North Carolina Assembly empowered its delegates to vote for independence. This is the first real push towards independence, and is not from Massachusetts or Virginia, the two most vocal groups, but tiny North Carolina. In June, the British arrive in New York, and another fleet tries unsuccessfully in taking Charleston, South Carolina. By now, Virginia is calling for a formal separation, led by Richard Henry Lee. On June 11th, Congress appoints a committee of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Livingston, and Roger Sherman to draft the Declaration of Independence, with Jefferson chosen to write it. How do you write such a document? How do you word it? It was a difficult task, for it had to be persuasive enough to get Americans in the middle to join the Patriot cause, and sympathetic Britons to urge royal restraint. It also needed to be worded in such a way to convince foreign powers, other monarchs, to pledge aid. The document is split in 3 parts, with the first being the intent, the second being a list of grievances, and the third officially dissolving ties with England. This was, and still is, a powerful document. The risk that they were taking by signing it, should the war have failed, they would have been tried for treason and hung. The risk they were taking was extraordinary, with no army, an outfitted navy, and no allies as of yet. This is why the 4th of July is important. This is why it still matters. This is the American dream, to take a stand and bet on yourself. I can't end it there, though. There's still more to be told. 17 days after being chosen, the committee turns in the draft of the Declaration. Slowly, through debate, it is whittled down to what we have now. Little known fact is that Jefferson, a Southern slaveholder, had put in a line blaming Britain for the slave trade. It was, of course, taken out for the sake of getting the Southern colonies to agree to independence. Finally, on July 2nd, with only New York abstaining, the other 12 colonies vote to approve the document. John Adams will be 2 days off on his assessment that July 2nd will forever be celebrated. On July 4th, the Declaration is sent off to all the colonies to be read, but it won't actually be signed until August 2nd. Independence wouldn't have been achieved without some help from our new allies, the French. On October 17, 1777, an American army led by Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold defeated a British army in upstate New York in the Battle of Saratoga. This was the biggest defeat in the war to this point, and it would convince the French, with the help of Benjamin Franklin, to fully support the American cause by sending troops to help fight. 5 years later, with the help of the French Navy, after a month-long siege, the British would surrender at Yorktown, Virginia. Our war for independence was the beginning of the Age of Revolutions, with the Haitian Revolution and French Revolution following close behind. Although the war would officially end in 1784 with the Treaty of Paris, the victory at Yorktown was seen as the end of the war. American independence would be justified, and it would finally be celebrated without fear of being erased. That hard-fought independence would be tested in 1812 in another war with England. In December 1814, the Treaty of Ghent would be signed with both sides returning to a status antebellum. But in January 1815, without knowledge of the treaty, General Andrew Jackson would defeat the largest British army ever massed in America in the Battle of New Orleans. Also in that war, with the British Navy bombing Baltimore after burning Washington, Francis Scott Key would pen the Star-Spangled Banner, which would eventually become our national anthem. In 1863, we had a different reason to celebrate the 4th of July. Amidst the perils of the Civil War, two Union armies were on the verge of forcing victory. On July 3rd, Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered General George Pickett to rush into well-fortified Union positions in the infamous Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. He suffered heavy casualties in the failed assault, and Lee would leave Gettysburg in defeat after 3 days of battle. At Vicksburg, Mississippi, Union General Ulysses S. Grant, after a prolonged siege, was able to get the Confederate garrison to surrender on July 4th. In a time when Americans were most divided, it was possibly the biggest celebration of the 4th of July ever, at least in the North, and it gave hope that the war was nearing its conclusion. July 4th has been a time of celebrations throughout history, but its significance has lost meaning. It is a time to come together, to celebrate the risk that was made for our freedoms. We must remember the words that Jefferson wrote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, political games are dividing us. We are more united than before, but you'd never know it. Remember the freedoms that were fought for, and treat every day like it's the 4th of July. One more quick note. Life is poetic sometimes, and 3 presidents and revolutionary figures passed away on July 4th. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, with Adams' last words supposedly being, "Thomas Jefferson survives," but Jefferson had died hours earlier. 5 years later, July 4th, 1831, James Monroe would too die. That does it for my videos, guys. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and check out my YouTube channel. If you have a suggestion on a future video, please let me know. Thanks again.